Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, quite a day in Westminster. If you haven't followed, there are essentially three threads to the story. A big U-turn on welfare cuts, which, it has to be said, was announced in some confusion and ambiguity. That's one. A full-blown crisis of government authority with pervasive backbiting and negative briefing, and an appearance of disarray, all of which justifies those Tories in turmoil headlines. And thirdly, there's a drama concerning the personalities, in particular Chancellor George Osborne's hopes of rising to the top have been badly dented. Let's start with him and the politics of this torrid few days. Here's our political editor, David Grossman.
In that well-worn Westminster cliché, there is a hole in the Chancellor's budget. But really, set in the context of total government spending, that hole is more a pinprick. There is a gaping void in the government, or more specifically, the Chancellor's reputation. Labour managed to drag a minister to the Commons today to answer a question on this budget disarray, but it wasn't the Chancellor, but his number three who turned up.
Does the Shadow Chancellor really want to talk about fiscal black holes? Does he really want to do that?
The government, though, has climbed down on not only £1.3 billion worth of disability benefit cuts, but also, to make sure it wins tomorrow's budget vote, it's conceding opposition amendments on VAT on tampons and on VAT on solar panels and insulation, both putting the government in possible conflict with the European Commission.
The budget has a big hole in it. It's really up to the Prime Minister to persuade his great friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to either come here and explain how he's going to fill that hole, or perhaps he should consider his position and look for something else to do, because clearly he hasn't been very successful at producing a balanced budget in the interests of everyone in this country, particularly those with disabilities.
This was easily the worst weekend for the government since the election. The departing Work and Pensions Secretary laying into the government and the Chancellor in a round of interviews.
Talk to enough Conservative MPs around this place and it becomes very clear that the disquiet in the party right now isn't about welfare per se. Indeed, many of Mr Osborne's and Mr Cameron's severest critics don't actually agree with Ian Duncan Smith on the matter. No, it's more about the way those at the top of the Conservative Party treat those lower down. The allegation you constantly hear is they're just too dismissive of those with traditional Conservative views.
There was still no sign of the Chancellor in Downing Street today. Instead, the Prime Minister was leaving for the Commons to make a statement on last week's EU summit. After apparently reacting with a four-letter tirade at Ian Duncan Smith's resignation last Friday, well, today he was emollient and complimentary about his former cabinet colleague.
My right honourable friend contributed an enormous amount to the work of this government, and he can be proud of what he achieved. And Mr Speaker, let me say this. This government will continue to give the highest priority to improving the life chances of the poorest in our country. And Mr Speaker, I want to...
That tone was well received on the Conservative benches, where many are feeling bruised and even insulted, particularly by the way the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have treated Conservative advocates of leaving the EU.
Well, I don't wish to be in any way critical of the Prime Minister. I think there's plenty of time to get this right, and I think his judgment of the mood in the House today was a sign that he's perfectly able to get it right. He was very respectful of people who wish to leave the European Union. He understands our passion and our enthusiasm for a more democratic, freer country that can spend more of its own money. He just happens to think there are arguments on the other side, and that's the kind of tone he's got to strike so that the party comes together easily after all the exertions of the referendum through to June.
Another blow to George Osborne came from Ian Duncan Smith's replacement at Work and Pensions, Stephen Crabb. In confirming a halt to the planned disability benefit cuts, he took a swipe at government by balance sheet.
As the Prime Minister indicated on Friday, I can tell the House that we will not be going ahead with the changes to PIP that had been put forward. I am absolutely clear, Mr Speaker, that a compassionate and fair welfare system should not just be about numbers. behind every statistic there is a human being. And perhaps sometimes in government we forget that.
There was, though, some confusion as to whether the government was now abandoning all welfare cuts for the rest of the Parliament. The Chancellor-shaped hole in today's events will be filled tomorrow by the man himself, who will speak in defence of his budget and his reputation.
Something to look forward to. David Grossman reporting there. Well, the Education Secretary, Nicky Morgan, is here to help us understand what's going on in her government. A very good evening to you.
Good evening.
Do you think the government did lose sight of, if you like, the compassionate conservatism agenda sometime in the last couple of years, that it just became too much about saving money at any expense, even from quite vulnerable people?
No, I don't think that at all. Certainly not, obviously, in, for example, my area of education reform, where we absolutely are focused on making sure that every child, regardless of birth or background, gets the great education that they are absolutely entitled to, but not in terms of the Treasury and previous budgets and announcements, or in terms of our manifesto. I mean, one of the biggest things has been about taking people out of paying income tax. 31 million people are paying less tax now than they did in 2010. The introduction of the national living wage, all of those things and many other reforms and announcements absolutely demonstrate that we are, as the Prime Minister said at the end of his statement, a modern, compassionate, conservative government.
OK. Now, look, I want you to look at a graph. This one's from the IFS. We'll put it up here. On the left, the incomes of the poorest and how they're going to change with tax and benefit cuts over this Parliament. On the right, the incomes of the richest. So as you go from left to right, you're looking from the poorest to the richest. And the big downward bars are the percentage losses in net income. Now, what you basically see is that the poorest are losing sort of 5 to 8 or more % of their net income. The top people on the right, the richest, are losing almost nothing with the proposed taxes and benefit change. What do you make of that graph?
Well, I think that tells one story in terms of the changes, but actually there's another graph which I think is very important in the distributional analysis impact that's published alongside the Red Book, which shows actually the impact of the different percentiles, and it shows actually that the richest have taken, they're paying more in terms of making a contribution to filling the black hole left by the last Labour government.
Right. So absolutely correct to say that the pattern would have been somewhat different if we'd taken other periods of coalition or Labour government measures. This is the 15 to 20. This is this Parliament. This is the pure Conservative government. And I'm just wondering whether there was a... Did you know, for example, that the poor were bearing the brunt this Parliament and the rich were bearing none of it?
Well, I'm not sure. Look, I mean, it's the first time, obviously, I've seen the graph. I haven't seen all the workings behind it. But it is something that I do look at very carefully every time, having been in the Treasury, every time a Red Book and an OBR set of forecast is published. And the fact is that by the end of this Parliament, the top 20% of this country are going to be paying more in tax than the other 80% put together.
I don't want to get stuck in statistics. This is an IFS graph. It is describing what's happened in this Parliament. And in effect, shouldn't we worry that you in the Cabinet, who are nodding through these things, have not seen the most basic distributional analysis of what this government's plans are for this Parliament? I agree, you can go back to other parliaments. The picture is, more progressive. But this is what you're planning for this Parliament. It was never described that way. It was never set out as a, now we want to give back to the rich. I mean, is that we're all in it together? Well,
I wouldn't, I'd say I haven't seen the detailed analysis that goes alongside this. I look very carefully at the distributional impact analysis published by the Treasury alongside the Red Book last week. The issue about people at the top paying more, the top 1% paying 28% of income tax. But look, the broader point you're making...
But these are the changes, and I appreciate that, but these are the changes. This is what your government is planning for this Parliament. Look, are you happy to call that one nation conservatism, compassionate conservatism? We're all in this together. Just look at it. 5 to 8% cuts in the incomes of the bottom deciles, and actually a very slight increase in the income of people in the
But Evan,
richest...
I don't know, because you haven't shown me the work, you haven't shown me this chart before I have sat here on live TV. I don't know how this takes account of things like the raising of the income tax threshold, the introduction of the national minimum wage and national living wage and everything else.
But I could have put the living wage in, but actually the picture is very much the same.
That is a huge step for a compassionate Conservative government in terms of helping people to have a national living wage.
I could show you, but it actually doesn't look very different if you put the living wage in. The Resolution Foundation have done it. They all look like this. And you, as a minister, Secretary of State, don't really even know that that's what the government is, because you're not being presented with that data.
Well, I made it very clear to you that I look at the distributional impact analysis, as I'm sure do other colleagues, that's published alongside the Red Book. I mean, you're right, I don't sit there and study the IFS figures, but I'm looking at the figures produced by the Treasury and the statistic that actually the top 20% are paying more in tax, the top 1% are paying 28% of income tax. And we made very clear last year in the general election campaign that yes, we were elected to continue to put a balance back in the economy, to pay down the deficit, to eliminate the deficit, to pay down the debt. But we were not going to do that off the backs of the most vulnerable in society.
You refer to paying down the debt, but actually, Ian Duncan-Smith was right to say, wasn't he, that actually the welfare cuts were being made to cut capital gains tax, 600 million, to cut the tax rates for the people around the higher rate threshold who were going to pay less tax, less 40% tax. Well, that's what the PIP squeeze was about. It wasn't about deficit reduction at all.
No, it wasn't about that. I mean, there is an issue with the introduction of the personal independence payments and the way that they have worked. And, you know, we were elected as a government to bring control to welfare spending, and I think that's still what people very much expect us to do. But they also expect us to get investment from companies, for people to be recognised if they are making investments and they're employing people. That's also what we've got to do. I mean, one of the things we've seen, one of the great achievements of the last government and this current one, is the continuing growth in the number of jobs. 2 million more people employed. That doesn't just happen overnight by magic. That happens from people making investment decisions to come here to employ. And some of those people as well, who obviously have been helped back to work by, I might add, Ian Duncan-Smith's reforms when he was Secretary for Work and Pensions, which is a record that he can be enormously proud of.
Can I ask you, on Thursday on Question Time, you described the PIP changes. I think you described them as, we've got to finish our consultation, the word you used. Did you misspeak, or had you been told to say that? Because they did look like policy in the budget, and then you'd turn them into consultation on the Thursday night.
No, I didn't misspeak. What I was saying was that we still had more conversations to have about those changes with members of Parliament, with disability groups, with those who were affected. Yes, the formal consultation had finished, but there was more to do, as there always is with any policy proposals.
They were in the budget book as policy, and then they were consultation. I mean, and this is the second budget, actually, George Osborne has given, because last year he put tax credit changes that had to be U-turned. Does he not take a big knock to his reputation, that basically every time he's announces a budget, we now expect some of it is going to be withdrawn subsequently, or some of it's going to be described as consultation a day later?
There wasn't a consensus around the proposed changes to the personal independence, nor to the tax credits last autumn. And I think actually it's a measure that a government listens to what people are saying and makes those changes. But actually, this is a Chancellor that took on a broken economy that has not only seen 2 million more people employed, that the deficit will be down by 2/3 at the start of the next financial year. We're now the fastest growing economy in the developed world. Now, these are significant achievements, and the only reason that last week we could spend £1.6 billion more on schools was because we have that strong economy. And that's the same for colleagues across government in terms of their departments. Those are big achievements of this Chancellor.
Just to clarify, last point, to clarify where there was some confusion early this evening. Stephen Crabb, new DWP Secretary, says no plans to change welfare. Most of us thought he meant this Parliament. Is that how you interpreted it?
Yes, and I think what Stephen is saying is that there are no planned changes. There obviously are changes that have been set out to welfare previously, which still have to work their way through, including things like the full implementation of universal credit. But obviously, I think any of your viewers watching would say it would be madness to rule out any further changes.
So it could happen, but no plans in train.
There are no plans in train.
If everything goes to plan, more or less, we've had all the welfare cuts we're going to have.
Yeah, that is my understanding.
That's your understanding.
That's
But if you don't understand, you're in the cabinet. Nicky Morgan, you're in the cabinet.
No.
How are we meant to understand if it's not clear? This is the day the whole thing was meant to be resolved. You're fighting back, and
the new Secretary of State for Work and Pensions was very clear. There are no planned changes to welfare in this Parliament. As I say, we've already announced some changes. I think Stephen's going to be a fantastic. It's a great shame to have lost Ian, but Stephen is going to be a very good Work and Pensions Secretary.
Nicky Morgan, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I've been getting away with it all.